أهلا بكل الذين ينضموا للاستماع إلى راديو بلدي أول راديو عربي أمريكي ويعنى بقضايا العرب في المهجر. برامجنا في راديو بلدي كل يوم جمعة من 8 وحتى 9 صباحا مع ليلى الحسيني في بث حي ومباشر عبر WNZK راديو 690 AM. صباح الخير بلدي، صباح الخير لكل مستمعينا.
Welcome to Radio Baladi, the first Arab, Middle Eastern, and American simulcast radio show. Radio Baladi is broadcast every Friday morning on WNZK 690 AM from 8 until 9 Eastern Time on Good Morning Michigan with Layla Al-Husseini. Our call-in number 248-557-3300. And now, stay tuned for the best radio talk show on Arab and American issues with your host, Layla Al-Husseini.
I am Atif Abdel Jawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WZMV 700 AM.
Good morning. Another ceasefire in Gaza had just collapsed. Israel and Hamas had agreed to a 72-hour humanitarian and unconditional ceasefire. They were to send delegations to Cairo to discuss a more durable truce. But violence has erupted again, with more people killed and one Israeli soldier believed abducted. More than 1,400 Palestinians have died, most of them civilians, and more than 50 Israeli soldiers have been killed. Israel says it's fighting in self-defense. Hamas says it wants to lift the siege imposed on Gaza, but the underlying question is, why is it taking more than 20 years to proceed with the two-state solution? Joining me to discuss these and other issues, Paul Sham, Director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland, and Khalid Al-Gindi, a scholar at the Brookings Institution and former advisor to the Palestinian Authority. Before we begin our discussion, feel free to call in with questions or comments. The number to call is 248-557-3300. That's 248-557-3300. My first question is for both guests, and let me start with Professor Sham. Why has it been more difficult to reach a ceasefire?
I think in this case, the political aims of both sides are paramount, and neither side is willing to give any quarter or credit or credibility to the other. Hamas has decided that it's a win-lose situation. It's in worse economic and political shape than it's ever been before, and it feels that it's fighting both for its life and for the people of Gaza. Israel sees it as existential because it feels Hamas wants to attack it, and it's so-called mowing the lawn, taking care of tunnels. But Israel is extremely dubious now about the possibility of a two-state solution. A long-term solution seems off the table for now.
Mr. Gindi, why has it been so difficult to get a ceasefire?
Well, one of the reasons is that unlike previous conflicts, this time around there is no real credible mediator that has the trust of both sides. In the last conflict 2 years ago, you had an Egyptian interlocutor that was able to speak to the Israelis credibly through the intelligence services and the military that had a long-standing relationship with the Israelis at that level. And on the other hand, you had Mohammed Morsi as president and his Muslim Brotherhood that had a direct line of communication to Hamas and was also seen as credible. And so both the Israelis and Hamas at that time had a credible interlocutor in Egypt. And Egypt, of course, was the key then, as it is now, since Egypt is the only other stakeholder, direct stakeholder to Gaza. It shares a border with both Gaza and Israel. You don't have that today. Today you have a regime in Egypt that views Hamas as an enemy of the state of Egypt, and does not have any real leverage with Hamas because it has minimal relations, residual relations, I would say, with Hamas, just by default, that they have been engaged in a massive crackdown against their own Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and that has extended to Hamas. And then of course you have a very close relationship, a military intelligence relationship between the Egyptian regime and Israel. But there hasn't been anyone who can affect Hamas's calculations, who is a credible, has some weight that can represent some of Hamas's demands, like lifting the blockade. That is at the table. You've had involvement of the Qataris and the Turks and others, but again, they are part of a very different regional dynamic than we had 2 years ago. The Egyptians and the Saudis and others are very hostile to Qatar and Turkey's involvement. And so Hamas, it's true that Hamas is in a much more weakened position than it was 2 years ago. Certainly, it's almost reversed. But I think it also matters that we don't have a credible mediator. And of course, the United States has no relationship with Hamas and has to speak through third parties to Hamas. So that's been a challenge throughout this last 24 days. But
Mr. Gindi, the current agreement or the ceasefire agreement that just collapsed called for both delegations, a Palestinian delegation and an Israeli delegation, to go to Cairo to negotiate or discuss a more durable ceasefire. So, in other words, what I'm trying to say that Hamas had agreed to go or to send representatives to talk with through Cairo about a more durable ceasefire.
Yeah, that's true, and I don't know that those delegations have been called off. I believe they were scheduled to arrive in Cairo this morning, and they may already be there. And the Palestinian delegation, as I understand it, is is a joint Palestinian delegation involving all of the factions, including Hamas. We don't know the circumstances just at this point of how the ceasefire collapsed. We do know that there is an Israeli soldier who was not abducted. I would say he's a soldier in combat. You have been captured. It is a war situation, so he's essentially a prisoner of war. And we do know also that there is a massive shelling and artillery fire on Rafah, on the border with Egypt, which is presumably where the capture of the Israeli soldier took place. So we don't know the sequence of events. We don't know how the Israeli soldier was captured. Did he stumble into Hamas-controlled area, or did Hamas use one of the tunnels to capture an Israeli soldier on the other side on Israeli territory? That we don't know, but we do know that Israel is bombing fiercely the Rafah area, and up to, I believe, just in the last few hours, about 70 Palestinians have already been killed. Israel places great value on its soldiers, and it is extremely casualty averse and capture averse, and it sees the capture of an Israeli soldier as very humiliating, and we're seeing some of that fury taken out on the population in Rafah.
Mr. Sham, Israel says it's bombing Gaza in self-defense, but even war has rules. Was Israel justified in killing that huge number of civilians?
My personal view is no, that it wasn't. I think that Israel, to try to explain why they went ahead and did it, I don't think it's because they couldn't care less about Palestinian lives. But Israel feels, and the amazing thing is that 95% of the Israeli Jewish population is behind this effort. They see it as an existential matter, as something that's protecting Israel from an invasion. Supposedly, there have been plans found that hundreds of Hamas soldiers would go through the tunnels around the time of the Jewish New Year in September and attack villages and kibbutzim near Gaza. So Israel feels that whatever it does, it's absolutely necessary to destroy those tunnels and destroy, at least for the time being, Hamas's offensive and even defensive capabilities. And the fact is the Gaza Strip is so small that Hamas couldn't, for the most part, even if it wanted to, remove its military infrastructure from civilian areas. So Israel feels it's doing what it has to. I don't think it's killing gratuitously, but I do think the death toll is so appalling that it should have tried harder to find other ways of dealing with the situation.
We have a caller on the line, Mr. Najib. Please introduce yourself and go ahead.
Good morning to you, Dr. Atif Abdel Jawad. Thank you for taking my call. and I salute you, your show, and salute your distinguished guest over there. Dr. Atif Abdel Jawad, in any war, as you know, there is no winner. Every party is a loser. And I know the loss at the Palestinian side is much greater than the Israeli side. But any life lost is a big loss and a tragedy because they are all human beings. Even one life lost is a tragedy. Dr. Atif Abdel Jawad, I know, and as you know, and a lot of people know, that the Arab League, it's a paralyzed organization. I'm sorry to say that. Half a century been established, and they are not doing nothing except meeting after meeting after meeting. But I want to address it to the United Nations, to the National Security Council of the United Nations. Mr. Atif Abdel Jawad, this National Security Council represents the most powerful country. United States of America, England, France, Russia, and China. I don't want nobody to come to be mediate between the Israeli and the Palestinian. I want the United Nations take their duty and act fast, not too late before the tragedy become bigger and bigger. So this is my question. Why the United Nations, through their National Security Council, do not act fast and do an emergency meeting, or maybe send some national observer in Gaza to watch and to monitor the ceasefire and to put an end for this tragedy. It's tragedy for all of us, Dr. Atif Abdel Jawad. And as an Iraqi Arabic, I will say salam, peace, and shalom. And thank you, Dr. Atif Abdel Jawad.
Thank you, Najib. We'll get a response from Dr. Argendi, but when we come back.
Ziyad brand. Quality products from our family to yours. Ziyad Brothers Importing offers the finest quality products, including brands like Sultan, Kraft, Nestle, Hook, Rico Picon, Dana, and many more. Ask your retailer to carry these fine products because you deserve the very best. For more information, visit our website at www.ziyad.com. That's www.ziyad.com. Ziyad, quality products from our family to yours.
Betsy's Bridal and Formal, Michigan's largest selection of special occasion dresses. Exclusive bridal and cocktail fashions for formal engagements, proms, showers, pageants, mother of the bride and groom, and full bridal wear. Sizes 6 through 30. Betsy's has over 33 years in the bridal business. We promise you the best quality service and alterations. Betsy's Bridal and Formal is located at 6189 Haggerty Road in West Bloomfield. Call 248-669-9999. That's 248-669-9999.
If you get into a car accident, how will you pick up the pieces when you can't work, when the bills pile up? Who will help you? Call 866-YOUR-RIGHTS.
I called Jumana. She took care of everything. My medical bill, lost wages, and even a large settlement.
I am Jumana Kiruz, and I assure you that my team will not stop until you get the most for your rights.
If you've been in a car accident, call Jumana. 866-YOUR-RIGHTS.
I am Atif Abdel Jawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WZMV 700 AM.
Welcome back to our discussion of the Gaza war and with our two distinguished guests, Dr. Khalid Al-Gindi, scholar at the Brookings Institution and former advisor to the Palestinian Authority, and Dr. Paul Sham, director of the Israel Studies at the University of Maryland. And Dr. Gindi, responding to the comment from Mr. Najib, who just called in a few minutes ago, he basically complaining that the Security Council isn't acting soon enough or fast enough.
Well, that's clear. I think the Security Council, and not just this conflict, but if you look at the many conflicts in the region, the Security Council has been very ineffective and slow to respond. And that has to do with, I think there are a great many factors. I think the UN as an institution is in need of reform, particularly the Security Council and the role in maintaining global peace and security, which is its primary role. The global global politics have changed, and the strategic situation around the world has changed considerably since the idea of the UN was conceived and the Security Council was established. It was established in the context of a bipolar world at the beginning of the Cold War, and that's no longer the case. And so the security threats, or the threats to global peace and security, have changed from bipolar world even to non-state actors. So it's partly a function of the fact that the UN is outdated in the way it operates, but it's also a function of the enormous turmoil in the region, where you have many conflicts and a great deal of bloodshed and a great deal of many atrocities being committed in Syria and Iraq. I think there is conflict fatigue. There is a lack of bandwidth, or the ability to pay attention to so many different conflicts at the same time. But also the role of key Security Council states, namely the 5 permanent members, the United States, the Russians, and others, are they're mired in other regional conflicts, both in the Middle East and beyond, and they're simply not up to the task. American leadership in particular, I think, has been lacking. So in the past, if you wanted to see Security Council action, you need American leadership either to facilitate it or to make it happen. And as we see from the deteriorating situation around the region, the United States is taking a back seat, essentially, and is disengaged from even much more horrible conflicts than what we see in Gaza. Hundreds of thousands have been killed in the Fertile Crescent, and the Security Council has been completely helpless. So I think the Gaza conflict is really just one of many signs of the breakdown of the international system in general, and the lack of leadership by the United States in particular.
Dr. Sham, Israel says it wants to disarm Hamas and destroy the tunnels in Gaza. Does that mean that the Israelis will leave Hamas in control of Gaza after all?
Most likely it does. The fatal flaw, in a sense, of the Israeli strategy is that they can't win the war in any permanent or meaningful sense. First, it would be very difficult to destroy Hamas, which is integrated into the population of the Gaza Strip. But even more important for Israel, if it were to effectively occupy the Strip again and destroy Hamas, then it would be where it was 10 years ago, occupying from within and controlling a population that hates it and that will be fighting against it every day. And it wouldn't be possible to capture it and turn it over to the Palestinian Authority. The PA cooperates with Israel, but this would be too far. It would be simply seen as a servant of Israel. So Israel has to, for its own reasons, try to destroy what it can of the tunnels and the infrastructure, but leave Hamas in control. It says it wants a demilitarized Gaza Strip. It's very hard to imagine how that could be worked out, that who would do it. So no matter what Israel does, it expects it may have to, or it may feel it has to come back in a couple of years and do it again.
Mr. Gindi, Hamas launched over 2,000 rockets into Israel with little impact. These rockets, as we know, were longer in range, but primitive and inaccurate. And they targeted Israeli civilians rather than military or strategic targets in Israel. Was that a plus or a negative for Hamas?
Well, obviously it's abhorrent to use any weapons and aim them at civilians in any context. So that's, I think, important to point out. But I think even from a military standpoint, it's not entirely clear what the rockets are intended to achieve. I appreciate Dr. Sham's assessment that Israelis feel that they are facing an existential threat. But as a matter of objective reality, Hamas rockets and even tunnels don't pose an existential threat to Israel. I think the use of the rockets is questionable, certainly from a moral standpoint, but also from a military and political standpoint. It's clearly tactical. There is not a major strategy behind it. There isn't a plan for liberating Palestine through the use of the rockets. They're simply intended to provoke, annoy, and kind of get attention to the issues that Hamas wants to get to focus attention on, whether it's Israel or Egypt or the international community. And in this instance, and most instances in the last 8 years, it's been the blockade. I think it's important that people remember that when Israel left the Gaza Strip, it took 8,000 settlers out of the Gaza Strip and removed all of its army. But it didn't leave Gaza open to the world. It closed Gaza's borders. It severed its relationship, Gaza's relationship with the West Bank. And eventually that is actually what helped bring Hamas to power in Gaza. It was once the borders were closed that after that Hamas was elected in early 2006, and then eventually took over when the international community refused to recognize any Hamas involvement in the government, it took control of Gaza forcibly in 2007, and at that point it became a full-blown Israeli blockade on Gaza. So that's part of the context, and the situation in Gaza from an economic and humanitarian standpoint is appalling. Even before this conflict, 95% of Gaza's water is not drinkable. It's contaminated with sewage as well as seepage from seawater. The destruction of the power plants the other day has made the spread of communicable diseases much greater, has increased the risk of serious health, deterioration in public health, because obviously you need power to pump sewage, and you have enormous amounts of people concentrated in a very small area, and even more concentrated given the displacement of about 40% of Gaza. So it's a very, very dire situation in terms of humanitarian and economic standpoint. And in that sense, I think Gazans actually feel that they are actually fighting an existential war against all odds. Obviously, they're not going to defeat Israel with Hamas rockets and tunnels, but they feel that they have no choice, despite the enormous price that they're paying in human terms and in destruction of whole neighborhoods and whole thousands and thousands of homes and infrastructure. They feel that going back to life under occupation and blockade and being suffocated is really not much better than death. This is kind of the way Palestinians in Gaza describe it. So Hamas is able to have that, as long as they have that general support, it will be, they feel empowered enough to continue.
Yes, are you still there?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. When we come back, I want to ask Dr. Argendi to explain to us why Hamas decided to start this war at this time, after the break.
Dr. Al-Zuhaili specializes in diabetes and endocrinology and has been conducting research for over 12 years. Right now, there are several clinical studies actively enrolling for both adult and pediatric patients with type 2 diabetes. Under Dr. Al-Zuhaili's care, participants in the clinical research trials receive free lab work, medical procedures, medical supplies, and medications to assist in their treatment. Qualified participants are also compensated for their time and travel in addition to receiving top care for their diabetes treatment and control. The research department is equipped with experienced and friendly staff who will work to manage patient care and schedule accommodations. Please contact Al-Zuhaili Medical Consultants at 1331 Monroe Street in Dearborn. Visit alzuhailidiabetes.com and call 313-581-8903. 313-581-8903.
New Concept Product and Design، رائدة إعداد وتجهيز المطاعم والمطابخ بالمعدات بشكل كامل، غرف التبريد والثلاجات. يمكننا مساعدتكم في الحصول على التمويل اللازم لمشروعكم، وكذا الحصول على الإجازات اللازمة من الدوائر الصحية. نخدمكم بخبرة 25 عاما. ناجي عبود صديقكم الدائم. للاتصال الهاتف رقم 248-442-9292 248-442-9292 وتماما على 33900 West 8 Mile Farmington Hills. للمزيد من التفاصيل زيارة الموقع الإلكتروني www.nuconceptproducts.com.
مؤسسة الحياة للإغاثة والتنمية في مدينة ساوثفيلد في ولاية ميشيغان، المؤسسة الرائدة في العمل الإغاثي والإنساني. مؤسسة الحياة ومنذ 20 سنة تقدم العون للفقراء والمحتاجين والمتضررين بسبب الكوارث الطبيعية أو الحروب في شتى أنحاء العالم. كما تقوم مؤسسة الحياة بكفالة الأيتام والعوائل الفقيرة وحفر آبار المياه في مناطق الحاجة، وأيضا تقوم مؤسسة الحياة بتزويد المشافي والمستوصفات الصحية بالأدوية والمعدات الطبية وإنشاء مدارس وعيادات طبية في أقطار عديدة من العالم. ومؤسسة الحياة مرخصة للعمل في الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، وجميع التبرعات معفاة من الضرائب. اتصلوا بمؤسسة الحياة للإغاثة والتنمية على رقم الهاتف المجاني 1-800-827-3543 أو زوروا موقعهم الإلكتروني على www.lifeusa.org.
I am Atif Abdel Jawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WDMV 700 AM.
Welcome back to our discussion of the Gaza fighting, and I would like to ask Dr. Gindi, why did Hamas start this war at this time? Some people believe that the reason is that Hamas may be losing grounds on several fronts.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Hamas started the war as such. I think the circumstances under which the conflict began was sort of a tit-for-tat, gradual escalation. Both sides seem to be being goaded by extremists within their own ranks, and then things actually got beyond the control of the political leadership of the two sides. If we remember that far back, it seems like another age. But back the original crisis that triggered the chain of events that led to this conflict began with the kidnapping and then eventual murder of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank. And at that time, the Israeli army went on a 3-week search campaign, to put it euphemistically, and in the process rounded up hundreds of Palestinians, mostly Hamas activists, rearrested those who had been released in past prisoner release deals. 6 Palestinians were killed in protests against the Israeli incursions and what Palestinians called a rampage. And after 3 weeks of that, Hamas began to fire rockets into Israel. Israel responded with some strikes in Gaza. There was an attempt at de-escalating, and then there was the issue of 7 Hamas people in a tunnel were killed, and for both sides, all bets were off. At that point, the discovery of the tunnel, and for Hamas, the loss of 7 of its fighters, and that's when we saw the rockets, and then everything sort of spiraled out of control. So it's not clear that. I think Hamas at a certain point decided that even if they didn't want a fight, they were prepared for one, and that it might actually be to their advantage, given, as was pointed out, their very much weakened position economically. I mean, they were basically had run out of money, and had agreed to the terms presented by the Palestinian Authority to reunify the government, not on their own terms. They were going to give up their essentially their control of government ministries. So they were coming at this from a point of weakness, politically, economically, and otherwise, and they probably felt that they could fall back on their traditional strength, which is quote-unquote resistance, and that would give them a boost in public opinion. They would reestablish their relevance in Palestinian politics, and to a great extent they have. There are rallies at this very moment in West Bank towns waving Hamas flags and very supportive of what Hamas is doing. And that, we didn't see that in the last few years. Hamas rallies were essentially banned in the West Bank, but now it's actually in the West Bank, Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority that is on the defensive. They have used this, I think, to leverage their position domestically, even if they know they can't defeat Israel on the battlefield, and even if it's isolated regionally and in the international community.
Do you agree, Dr. Sham, with Sargendi that Hamas was not the party that started this fighting?
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with everything Dr. Gindi said. I just want to point out that both of these wars are seen by their populations as necessary. That Netanyahu is seen in Israeli terms as being somewhat reluctant to go in. I think neither side planned this or expected something of such brutality and violence, and I think the charges or assumptions on both sides that the other side really planned this and had a strategy, I think is simply wrong. Both sides are frustrated, angry, and had political objectives they were trying to reach, and both of them collided with equally strong determination on the other side.
Almost 59 Israeli soldiers have been killed so far, and that's a high toll for Israel. Yet, public opinion, as you said, Dr. Sham, is supportive of the current operation. When do you think the Israelis will say enough is enough?
I think, in a sense, the more soldiers that are killed, the more Israelis feel this has to be a complete and successful operation. That the pressure for a ceasefire is coming more from outside than from inside. I think both sides are more or less ready, but neither is giving up their political objectives. I imagine in the next few days there will be a repeated attempt to make the ceasefire work, and probably within the next week that will happen. But I think Israel will try to destroy as many tunnels as it finds. It seems as if it's done most of them, so it might be willing to stop and feel its objectives have been reached. But the question is, will Hamas accede to a ceasefire which leaves the blockade in place?
Mr. Gindi, Gaza is under siege, but technically was not under occupation before the current operation. As you know, Israel removed its troops and settlements from Gaza in 2005, and yet Hamas says it's fighting to end the occupation. And in the occupied West Bank, we have President Mahmoud Abbas, who is in charge of trying to end the occupation there. So what's the story here?
Well, actually, just to clarify, technically Gaza is still under occupation. The legal definition of occupation is based on effective control. Israel controls air, land, and sea borders. It enforces its control quite rigidly. It even controls the population registry in Gaza. So every Palestinian child who's born is registered with Israeli officials before it can be considered official. Israel issues the IDs that Palestinians have in Gaza. So it is still under occupation. The removal of the Israeli army does not end that occupation, and I think it's recognized even by the United States as still occupied. As far as Mahmoud Abbas and the West Bank, I think part of Hamas's appeal and part of their strength is to be able to contrast what they do with what Mahmoud Abbas has done. And Mahmoud Abbas has committed himself to peaceful negotiations and to resolve the conflict that way, to end the occupation that way. And as most Palestinians know, it hasn't worked. And so one of Hamas's key strengths is to be able to capitalize on that failure of the negotiations process and say, those guys have promised you an end to occupation through negotiations, and here we are 20 years later, and nothing's changed. We, on the other hand, we being Hamas, in their narrative, we have done damage to Israel. We have been able to shut down their airport. We have been able to get concessions from Israel. It's very notable that prisoner releases, compare the prisoner release of a year and a half, 2 years ago with Hamas, in which more than 1,000 Hamas prisoners were released. Compare that to the extraordinary reluctance in recent months to release prisoners, even to follow through on the last batch of prisoners that would have allowed the negotiations to continue. And actually Israel's refusal to release them led to the collapse of the last round of negotiations. So Hamas says our way is effective. Mahmoud Abbas's way gets no results. It only gets him ignored. And unfortunately, it has been the case that violence does on some level pay. It comes at an extraordinarily high cost, obviously. But politically, Hamas can point to that and say we achieve more through violence than Mahmoud Abbas can through peaceful negotiations.
By the way, Dr. Gindi, who has the final word within Hamas? Who is the ultimate decision maker?
That's a good question because it's not entirely clear that the political leadership, which theoretically should be calling the shots, is actually doing so. We've seen moments throughout this conflict, and even before this conflict, but especially since the fighting began, where Hamas officials, members of the political leadership outside of Gaza say one thing, and the military wing inside Gaza says something else. We've seen that in past ceasefire announcements. So I think the longer this fighting goes on, the people directly on the ground are essentially the ones who are calling the shots. And for now, that is the military wing or the Qassam Brigade that is calling the shots in this process. That may change as the cost-benefit calculations shift. And I think the capture of an Israeli soldier and the massive Israeli response to that might potentially shift that balance back to where at least the political leadership inside Gaza will have more influence and maybe some control to be able to rein in the military wing. But that's, of course, just speculation.
We'll be back after the break.
لكافة أعمال بيع وشراء العقارات السكنية والتجارية المناسبة لكم اتصلوا بالخبيرة العقارية سناء بريخو، خبرة طويلة تساعدكم في الحصول على القرض وإتمام المعاملات بالسرعة المناسبة، والأهم ثقة في التعامل. مجاز رسميا من ولاية ميشيغان في عمليات البيع والشراء في جميع المدن التي ترغبونها. اتصلوا مباشرة بسناء بريخو على الرقم 248-755-3494 248-755-3494. مكتب المحامي زياد قاصد مختص بربح قضاياكم بما يتعلق بالفولكلوجر ديفنس وحماية بيوتكم من البنوك بوقف حجز المنازل. كما يتعامل مكتبه بالقضايا الجنائية، جميع قضايا الهجرة، قضايا الإفلاس، تعويض العمل، وقانون الشركات والأعمال التجارية. لديهم موظفون يتكلمون لغتكم العربية والكلدانية. When comes to foreclosure defense اتصلوا بالمحامي زياد قاصد فلديه الحل. Call in 248-680-7300 248-680-7300. الاستشارة مجانية.
I am Atif Abdel Jawad. Join me the first Friday of each month at 8 a.m. Eastern Time. I will be discussing some of the most important issues and events in the Middle East live on America's Voice of the Arabs. WNZK 690 AM and WDMV 700 AM.
Welcome back to our discussion of the fighting in Gaza, and my question now is for Dr. Paul Sham. Do you think, Mr. Sham, that Israel would want to hand Gaza over to the administration of President Mahmoud Abbas, as was the case in 2005 and 2006?
I think in theory they would, but I think they'd have, and correctly, serious doubts as to whether Abbas and the Palestinian Authority could really control it and protect Israel, which is, of course, what Israel is most concerned about. They see Hamas as more popular with at least parts of the Palestinian population, and they're afraid that he might not control it. And a lot of the Israeli government isn't in favor of a two-state solution anyway. So a lot of them would be willing to probably, at least in theory, to take it over and simply suppress any opposition. But in the theory, of course, Israel would like to see that, and probably would want to see some international help for that. The irony, as has been mentioned, is that Israel is more or less supported against Hamas by most of the Sunni countries nearby, Egypt especially, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. So they have some depth of support in the Arab world.
Dr. Gandhi, the two-state solution seems to be what everybody wants, what at least everybody's talking about. Yet it's taking more than 20 years of failed negotiations while Israel keeps building more settlements on the West Bank. Is the two-state solution still viable?
I would say the two-state solution is theoretically still possible. But it will take an enormous shift in how the process has been pursued thus far to make it happen. It will require a sea change in Washington in terms of how we deal with Gaza, which has been severed from the process for 7 years. The United States effectively has not had a policy on Gaza, treating Gaza as though it were a separate conflict from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where you could make peace with Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank while Israel makes war on Gaza. That whole mindset, I think, has been disastrous. It has produced conflict after conflict and made a resolution of the conflict impossible. So there has to be a change with regard to how the United States and Israel look at Gaza and Hamas. Hamas is part of the solution, and if it's not part of the solution, it's part of the problem. As long as you exclude Hamas, you cannot pretend that Hamas exists militarily, but that it doesn't exist politically. It is there. It has the ability to disrupt almost anything that you choose to do. So I think it will require enormous changes in Washington in particular, but at the same time, I'm not sure that Washington is capable of shifting its policies in that way, mainly because of domestic political considerations. And so the U.S. is essentially paralyzed, in which case, while the two-state solution might still be theoretically possible, the United States is probably no longer in a position to be the one to actually get us there. If it will happen, it will not be because of the United States. It will be despite the United States.
Dr. Sham, we have 1 minute left. Do you think Israel is serious about the two-state solution?
I think most Israelis would like to see it. However, the right-wing government now is divided between those who are extremely skeptical of it and those who are absolutely against it. I think if there is an Israeli leader who could mobilize people and show that it's in Israel's interest, it could happen. But at the moment, Israelis are so skeptical and even scared, and certainly don't trust Palestinians, and the U.S., as Khalid said, empowers that I don't see anything happening in the near future.
Thank you, Dr. Paul Sham of the University of Maryland. Thank you, Dr. Khalid Gandhi of the Brookings Institution. And see you the first Friday next month. Goodbye.